Thank you for making the chairs look nice.
I'm not putting all the panels back on yet because yeah, that one works.
Is it turned on?
Yeah.
Oh, you turned them on though, right?
Yeah. So this one works. So let me pack that. But every time you put these back,
Oh, yeah.
this one works. You unplug this one. It doesn't.
Is the time on? Yeah.
What's that?
The timer.
Oh yeah, I see the timer.
See the timer?
These are the only ones that it still does. Or these ones it does still work on.
Okay.
Yeah. I worked with Daryl, I don't see any others. Oh, wait. I see one.
Oh, that's what you have to.
This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry on the National Forest System, Restoring Our Forest Infrastructure, will come to order. Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to the hearing of the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee on the National Forest System, Restoring Our Forest Infrastructure, a critically important topic. I would also like to thank Ranking Member LaMalfa, who will be arriving shortly, for his engagement on this issue, as well as each subcommittee member for taking part in this hearing today. The roads, trails, bridges, dams, and other facilities that make up our national forest infrastructure help ensure safe and reliable access to national resources and serve as essential backbone for our economic activity. More than 140 million Americans visit national forest lands every year to camp, hike, fish, hunt, ski, and more. Recreation on and around Forest Service land contributes more than $10 billion to the U.S. economy every year and supports more than 143,000 full-time and part-time American jobs. In addition to recreation, 66 million Americans in over 3,000 communities depend on Forest Service infrastructure for drinking water and wastewater services. And many communities rely on Forest Service roads to drive their children to school, shop in neighborhood stores, and visit their doctors. However, as a consequence of deferring maintenance across the agency's infrastructure portfolio, our forest infrastructure is in disrepair and no longer meets the needs of forest users, local communities, and emergency responders. As is the case with all federal land management agencies, appropriated funds have so far been insufficient. With a deferred maintenance backlog of $5.2 billion, the ability of the American public to safely access and benefit from national forests is greatly diminished. As many of our subcommittee members know all too well, one contributing factor to this acute backlog has been soaring fire suppression costs. The increasing frequency and intensity of wildfires has forced the agency to make some tough decisions, often pulling funds from non-fire accounts to address wildfires and leaving fewer and fewer resources to support other aspects of the agency's work, like deferred maintenance. We hope that the fire fix that goes into effect in FY20 helps address this part of the deferred maintenance challenge. Despite the challenges of aging infrastructure, the dedicated public servants at the Forest Service have continually worked to do more with less and to deliver upon their mission to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. Proper maintenance of our national forests is a matter of safety and economic well-being. I hope this hearing will help us better understand the severity of the deferred maintenance backlog, its impact on regional economies, and the agency's future plans for capital improvement. With that, I will recognize the ranking member once he has arrived. But in consultation with ranking member and pursuant to the Rule 11E, I want to make members of the subcommittee aware that other members of the full committee may join us today. The chair would recognize other members, would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the witness may begin her testimony and to ensure there's ample time for questions today. I would like to welcome our witness, Ms. Lenice Lago, Associate Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. In coordination with the Chief, Ms. Lago helps lead a workforce of more than 28,000 year-round employees and an additional 12,000 seasonal employees, and is a steward to 193 million acres of national forest and grasslands. Ms. Lago worked briefly in the forest products industry before joining the Forest Service in 1989. She has worked in a variety of planning, budget, and resource management jobs, splitting time between Washington, D.C. and the Western United States, including Montana, Washington, and Oregon. Associate Chief Lago is a native of Athens, Georgia, and a graduate of the University of Georgia's Warnell School of Forest Resources. Ms. Lago, you will have 5 minutes to present your testimony. The light will turn yellow, signaling when you have 1 minute left to complete your testimony. Please begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to share the administration's views on infrastructure within USDA's Forest Service. I want to thank and acknowledge how important this opportunity is to testify on this important topic. I'd also like to thank you for the support you've given us to carry out our programs. Infrastructure is the physical link between Americans and their public lands, and Forest Service infrastructure is vital to rural and urban communities alike. It includes roads, trails, bridges, visitor centers used by the public, as well as offices, air tanker bases, employee housing, water and wastewater systems, which we use to manage and protect all of the other resources. People depend on a safe Forest Service road network to get to schools, to hospitals, homes, stores. The road system is also critical to carrying out active management to improve forest conditions. Infrastructure drives the economic benefits communities derive from national forests. The Forest Service provides the most diverse recreation opportunities in the nation across world-class landscapes that attract, as you mentioned, Madam Chairman, over 140 million visitors annually, contributes $10 billion to the U.S. economy each year, and supports over 140,000 jobs, mostly in gateway and rural communities. Outdoor recreation and tourism are the single greatest source of jobs for local economies on the National Forest System. Perhaps most critically, forest infrastructure provides fire protection for communities. Firefighters and emergency responders use forest infrastructure to access forest lands for firefighting operations, to protect communities, to evacuate families from areas at risk, and to rescue individuals from danger. I know a specific interest here today is deferred maintenance, and my written testimony includes tables listing various assets the Forest Service owns and maintains, and the deferred maintenance by asset category. I'm not going to cite all that here, but just to roughly identify the portfolio that we're talking about, the Forest Service maintains over 370,000 miles of roads. That includes over 6,000 bridges. We have 158,000 miles of trail, including over 7,000 trail bridges. We have almost 40,000 buildings of all types, including administrative buildings, research buildings, employee housing, and recreation sites. I think you know, deferred maintenance is scheduled maintenance that doesn't get done. It has a dollar value, and the dollar value accumulates over time. As a result of deferred maintenance, the state of the Forest Service infrastructure has fallen far behind what's necessary to meet the needs of our forests and our forest users. Today, the Forest Service has a deferred maintenance backlog of more than $5.2 billion. Our capital improvement budget has not kept up with needed maintenance. The President's budget request for fiscal year 2020 includes a public land infrastructure fund which allocates monies for deferred maintenance on the National Forest System. Another funding source for Forest Service infrastructure comes from the Federal Highway Administration Federal Lands Transportation Program. Interestingly, while the Forest Service has more miles of publicly accessible road and many times more bridges than other federal land management agencies, the Forest Service receives only about 5% of the funding from this program. In addition to funding, the agency is doing its part to reduce deferred maintenance. We're taking bold steps to streamline our environmental review process and speed up important work that could protect communities' livelihoods and resources. We're using tools provided by Congress as well. We have continued to use conveyance authority, which allows us to sell facilities that are no longer needed and keep the proceeds to address other infrastructure needs. We just proposed our rulemaking for the Powerline Utility Corridor Authority from the 2018 Appropriations Bill and the Communication Sites Authority from the 2018 Farm Bill, in addition to the Leasing Authority, which was included in the 2018 Farm Bill. FLORIA, the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, has enabled us to keep up with needed maintenance at heavily used, developed recreation sites across the country. So with funding, innovation, efficiency, and partnerships, those are the keys to taking care of these important assets. Managing a healthy infrastructure is an important part of our job, and it supports our ability to carry out our mission. Again, I'm deeply grateful to the committee for this opportunity to talk about our infrastructure, to share ideas about how to improve our backlog of deferred maintenance, and we appreciate your support. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Before proceeding to questions, I recognize Ranking Member LaMalfa for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I have no excuse for my tardiness, but I did bring a forest green pen today if there's any redeeming value to that. So thank you. And thank for joining with us, Associate Chief Lago. As we know, the National Forest System, created more than 100 years ago, designed, and this is an important key point, for multiple uses for the surrounding communities. And so it's a vast network, 193 million acres of public land, and much of the infrastructure, like we hear with our national park system, is aging and requires regular upkeep, which hasn't been quite regular. We have budget challenges such as fire borrowing, loss of revenue through declining timber harvest, all contributing to the backlog we're talking about. Significant portion of the backlog, nearly 75%, is maintenance of the 370,000-mile road system within our forests. A lot of that in California, my home state. Of course, the maintenance of these forest roads cannot be understated, and they provide access to the public for access to their lands, recreation, and resources. They connect our communities, and they're very important for our firefighters, of which we suffer a lot of fire in the West lately. Congress has worked to provide several solutions to address the deferred maintenance, such as providing the fire funding fix in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018 to prevent fire borrowing, something we're all happy about, from other accounts, including those accounts used for national forest roads. The 2018 Farm Bill provided more tools for the Forest Service with management of forest lands and allows more partners to assist them in these activities. The House-passed version of the Farm Bill also contains several provisions that would have strengthened these goals, including several categorical exclusions that would have addressed bureaucratic red tape that has hindered the Forest Service from addressing many of the maintenance issues we will be talking about today. Unfortunately, that version did not make it through the Senate last year. Earlier this year, though, the Forest Service announced they were working on streamlining environmental analyses. I believe it's common sense that current facilities should be able to be improved without wasting significant time and money due to unnecessary hurdles. The Forest Service has recently completed a comprehensive capital improvement plan also that we hope can be a strategy to help address this maintenance backlog and get back to a healthy and sustainable functioning forest system. Again, Associate Chief Lago, we appreciate you being here today and look forward to dialogue and Q&A. So thank you, and I appreciate it, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Members will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority for members who were here at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of their arrival. I first recognize myself for 5 minutes. Associate Chief Lago, in your written testimony, you mentioned the Forest Service currently has a deferred maintenance backlog of more than $5.2 billion. Can you speak to the backlog's impact on local economies, including recreational outfitters and other small businesses that serve locals and visitors alike? Additionally, please discuss the impact on local small businesses that would complete some of the infrastructure work on projects such as building and maintaining roads.
Certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair. So the condition of deteriorated infrastructure means we can't provide access or we can't provide a full season of use to many users of national forest lands. You mentioned outfitter and guides, campground operators. Just to bring it down to the operator level, an outfitter and guide needs road access typically some parking lots, uses campgrounds sometimes, boat launches. When we can't keep those open, or when we have to restrict the season of use, that means that outfitter and guide has to reduce their season days. It has a direct economic effect on that outfitter and guide. The same with a campground. If a campground operator is charging a fee and we can't maintain the water system, so we have to shut the water off to that campground, they can still have campers, but they'll have to provide their own water. It degrades the experience for campers, and they're less likely to go to that campground. Again, a direct economic hit to a service provider. How increasing our maintenance affects local economies is, for the most part, that deferred maintenance is carried out by contractors, partners, service providers in those local communities.
Thank you. And I do have a second question with a little bit of a personal bit to it. I have been a Girl Scout leader for the past 5 years, and I've seen the importance of scouting and the role that the outdoors play in the lives of young women and in boys who participate in Boy Scouts. And events like the upcoming Hike-a-Palooza in George Washington National Forest not only provide young women with the opportunity to explore the outdoors, but also promotes environmental stewardship and provides exposure to careers in conservation. The Forest Service's ability to maintain its infrastructure is central to ensuring that the future generations are invested in conservation and have the opportunity to enjoy our country's stunning public lands. On the topic of environmental stewardship, I understand the Forest Service relies on partnerships and volunteers in addition to federal funding. Can you tell us about some of these cooperative agreements and how they help maintain safe, accessible trails in places like the George Washington National Forest?
Sure. Thank you for that. And just generally speaking, the total value of our partnerships and agreements is over $1 billion annually, and more than half of that is contributed by the partner. Within the volunteer service hours that we rack up, trails work represents the majority of that work. We have people volunteering to do trail maintenance that is more than 1.5 billion hours annually. That's more than 800 full-time equivalents, and they help us maintain over 30,000 miles of trail a year. And in your local forest, the GWJF, we have more than 50 cooperators on trails projects. I think last year they helped us maintain almost 5,000 miles of trail. We have partnerships with Student Conservation Organization, Backcountry Horsemen, lots of partnerships interested in helping us maintain that infrastructure.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answering my questions, and I would now recognize Ranking Member LaMalfa for his first question.
Okay, thank you again. Assistant Chief, we're talking about, and you mentioned in your comments, a $5.2 billion maintenance backlog, and that's been a number that seems to be frozen for quite a few years, I think going back as far as 2012, which if you look at inflation costs alone, but then obviously we've had some big events there in many of our forests with large fires, runoff, record levels of snowpack and flooding, et cetera. And we hear about it from our forest people out there, that there's considerable damage to the roads, trails, et cetera, culverts. But the dollar figure has stayed the same since 2012. So it makes me wonder, is there really some type of system to how the Forest Service is monitoring, cataloging the damage to the various pieces of infrastructure in the forests, to see that we're actually keeping up with the real number on the maintenance backlog that we're talking about. Again, we know there's a huge number for national parks, and I'm wondering how well is there a system in place that we could be improving, or one that you're working on to get what probably needs to be a more accurate number?
Yes, sir. So it is, first of all, a big number. And as I described, our totality of infrastructure is big, diverse, spread out, and inaccessible. The way we arrive at that number is we do sampling on an annual basis. We sample a portion of the roads and then calculate an estimate. We sample buildings and dams buildings and bridges buildings and dams on a 5-year cycle, dams on a 2-year cycle. But in addition, events like fires and floods can take out bridges. Sometimes we don't replace them. So that removes the asset and it removes the deferred maintenance along with it. We're doing lands transactions every year, and we may convey an asset with deferred maintenance and thus reduce it. And, then
With the loss of a bridge in a situation like that, you can take it off the books because it doesn't exist anymore. Now, on my farm, if one of my tractors catches fire, I don't get just to write off the asset. I still need that amount of tractor power to be able to get over the acres I do in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So how is this going to be serving the people in the area, whether it's for firefighters, access, logging, whatever it is? How can we just write that asset off?
But it depends on the local area, and a lot of these assets are legacies from many, many years ago. It might be in a portion of the forest where access has been terminated or is seasonally closed, and we may decide not to replace that bridge in kind, but do some sort of lower scale, more like a trail bridge or something like that.
Is that done in conjunction with local needs, with local, whether it's safety officials or logging or access? Is that decision made in DC? Is it made by the local forester? I mean, that's kind of disturbing to me that we can just write this off and maybe not have the input. How does that done?
Yes, sir. It's a local decision. It's done with public input, environmental analysis, and disclosure.
Okay. So timber receipts have been down. Back years ago, we're looking at 1991, we could see that there was $680 million in timber receipts, of which 10% goes directly towards forest roads, and it's also very important, those receipts for local schools and roads under what is the Secure Rural Schools Fund. And so in 91, it was $680 million in the receipts, and now more recently it's down to 21 million. So it would seem to me we could be going farther if we had the timber receipts for the road maintenance for that 10%. Would you comment upon that?
Yes, sir. In recent years, we have been increasing our timber sales. Those receipts are increasing as a result of that. And so,
do you know that number now compared to the $680 million not inflation-adjusted 1991 number?
I don't know the total revenue, but I believe our timber receipts, I'll have to get back to you. No,
okay,
I don't.
Please do. So with them down significantly, is recreation is a primary driver of road use. How much is being done to boost what's coming in on recreation fees, not by just raising the fees, but actually having more access in order to keep from losing more roads to deterioration?
Mm-hmm. Our annual recreation fee collection is about $100 million. 85% of that goes back to the site where it was generated, and the decision about fees for recreation use is on a site-by-site basis.
I mean, as far as in boosting the amount of recreation happening, is that part of the strategy?
On an individual site basis, the local management can and does suggest for a fee increase or to add an additional site into the fee revenue program.
Yeah, I'm not angling for fee increases, but just more access where it's possible. So I'm over time. I'll yield back, Madam Chairman.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chief Lago, for being here this morning. I want to change the subject a bit to Job Corps, if we could just talk about that for a bit. The Job Corps Civilian Conservation Centers in particular. We know that last year, almost 2,000 Job Corps students from underserved communities contributed more than 100,000 hours to infrastructure improvements and to maintenance projects. Tell me what you see as the opportunity to grow that program.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Just this week, Secretary of Agriculture Perdue traveled to Denver, National Job Corps headquarters, and met with our Job Corps leadership, several center directors, and laid out a plan for a more formal program between national forests and the Job Corps centers where they reside to have more students doing restoration and maintenance work on Forest Service facilities, more conservation-related trades at Job Corps centers, and ultimately more hiring of Job Corps graduates into Forest Service jobs.
So if I understand you correctly, then USDA is supportive of the program, wants to keep the program, and is going to try to broaden the program.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's good. Let me also ask, do the students who participate in this program have any path toward becoming employed with the Forest Service or some other land management agency?
Yes, ma'am. We have currently authority called Public Land Corps Authority, which Job Corps students qualify for by doing a certain number of hours of restoration work on public land. That they still are required to compete for jobs in an open merit application. What we'd like to do is work with OPM on a direct hire authority for Job Corps graduates.
So can you tell me, just for maybe some of my colleagues' benefit who are not familiar with the program, how has this program helped the agency?
Well, you said it yourself, more than 2,000 students and 100,000 hours on projects doing restoration work on national forests. In addition to those numbers, we have upwards of 300,000 students annually supporting firefighting, either doing things like mobile cooking camps or actually being on the fire line. About, I think 10 of our 24 centers have conservation trades. You know, the typical trade at Job Corps is carpentry, masonry, plumbing, painting, auto mechanics. We have 10 centers where we have forestry-related trades, and we'd like to expand the conservation trades to all of our centers.
Well, I just appreciate the fact that the program is going to continue. It's an outstanding program. I think it gets young people involved at a level that we could never do it in any other way. So I thank you, Chief, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess, what's the primary purpose of the National Forest?
To have enduring natural resources for the nation.
And it's specifically for recreation or for people. I know there's some money making, but I think sometimes we forget the main thing has got to be the main thing. And it's to provide opportunities for people who may not have forests of their own to go enjoy that, either recreational, and also there's some financial benefits to the United States as a whole. But it's to provide those opportunities, recreational and hunting and other things for our people. So I just ask that you remember the main thing has always got to be the main thing. And so I ask that we do all that we can to keep that open and accessible to all those hunters and recreationals and campers and bikers and cross-country runners and trail, hikers, that we do everything we can, because that's the purpose of these national forests, I think, when it was originally, is to keep that open. So that being said, the House Farm Bill last time contained several categorical exclusions that would have streamlined NEPA for reconstructing or rehabilitating national forest infrastructure, from roads to dams and bridges, even bathroom and shower facilities at recreational sites. How would these CEs have been helpful to saving time and money while addressing the backlog of deferred maintenance programs?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. So the CEs that did not get included in the Farm Bill are very similar to the CEs we've just proposed in our rulemaking for NEPA for for infrastructure, for roads, bridges, and facilities. And we have existing CEs for routine maintenance. But most of our facilities need something beyond routine maintenance, major reconstruction, decommissioning. And so these CEs in the footprint of an existing structure allow us to consistent with state law, federal law, documenting a decision, do that work without going through a longer environmental analysis.
And I just want you to understand, this has major impacts. I got several calls last year. We closed some national forest roads, trails that cars could go on, to my squirrel hunters and folks who use those national forests to do that. So there's significant impact that maybe you guys don't always see, but I can assure you when you start getting calls at a congressional office, because my squirrel hunters can't get to where they want to go. And so what have we done to do public-private partnerships? Are you forbidden to do that? Because a lot of these folks would go out and improve those trails, which would also make them accessible to fight fires. Or are we co-opting with 70% of the engineers in the entire United States Army are in the Garden Reserves? Camp Shelby is a national forest, which you have engineers, and they just did a new running trail down there in the old rail bed system. What opportunities are we using that to use those to help us with the maintenance under the supervision of the Forestry Department?
Yes, sir. Thank you. In a minute and 47 seconds, I won't be able to tell you all the partnerships that we have, but for example, we have partnerships with user groups, and I mentioned before, Student Conservation Association, Ducks Unlimited. We also have partnerships with counties in particular that help us maintain roads. The Army National Guard has an authority because they are largely engineers. They can do major construction, reconstruction, demolition work on our sites and our facilities. The pathway to those things is the instrument that documents the agreement and what each side needs to do. We can be bureaucratic about that. We need to instill all of our workforce with the curiosity and the innovation to use those partnerships.
What can we in Congress and on this committee do to make that process easier?
Sir, the attention in this hearing is tremendous value. I'll confer with my staff about what's limiting in those partnerships and be happy to visit with your staff.
Please let me know, as an Army engineer who still serves, I'm interested in whatever we can do to make this easier for y'all so that we can serve the main thing, the public that we're trying to give opportunities for recreation to. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Maine for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Chair and Ranking Member for holding this hearing, and to Associate Chief Lago. Thank you very much for being here today and for your long career in service in the Forest Service. That's so important to all of us. I'm also on the House Appropriations Committee, the Interior Subcommittee, so we had a very interesting an instructive hearing earlier this year with Chief Christensen. We appreciated that very much, and also have spent a lot of time trying to understand the funding of the Forest Service and the unique challenges you have been dealing with because of the wildfires and the challenges out west. I'm going to take a little different tack because I'm a representative from Maine, and in Maine we know the importance of our forests. 86% of Maine is forested land. Only 6% of that is public, so very different from the issues we deal with in the West. I think that's the highest percentage of any state in the nation. We have almost 17 million acres of forest, 16 million of which are privately owned, and that supports about 30,000 good-paying jobs. One imminent concern that we feel our forests can help us with is the issue of climate change, but it also presents a challenge. Forests are facing rising temperatures, increased and prolonged drought, extreme weather events, invasive species, all contributing in many ways to widespread declines in the forest health. But on the other hand, forests can be a positive force for change in the climate debate because of their role as carbon sinks. Just last week, there was an article in the Portland Press-Herald in Maine highlighting the carbon store capacity of our Maine forests. And without objection, Madam Chair, I'd like to submit that for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. By promoting the value of working forests in the United States and recognizing the continual cycle of growth, harvesting, and replanting, our working forests provide a carbon solution. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the efforts by the Forest Service that promote healthy working forests and the carbon benefits associated with growing trees and the wood products they produce?
Yes, Congresswoman, thank you. So we have a branch of the Forest Service called State and Private Forestry. We have authorities under state and private forestry that enable us, and first of all recognizes there's 800 million acres of forested land in this country owned by states and private entities, and it is just as important to for conservation on those lands as on federal lands. So our state and private forestry authorities allow us to work with state foresters, private landowners, industrial corporations on conservation efforts. Just this morning, talking about innovation and partnerships, one of my colleagues sent me an announcement from the National Forest Foundation, U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities, and the Forest Service Partnership Office announcing grants for public-private partnerships for forest stewardship and forest conservation. There's a lot of growing interest in the importance and the benefits to all of us from a health standpoint, from a climate change standpoint of keeping forests healthy. Finally, in the southeast and in the northeast, we have programs called Keeping Forests. They're big partnerships between us, state foresters, industrial landowners.
So just to tack on one of the earlier questions, I know the Forest Service is trying to streamline NEPA review to make it easier for people to manage forests without significant environmental review. But what will you do if those management practices aren't actually storing carbon? Are they considering carbon sequestration in their efforts to streamline NEPA reviews, or is that not part of the consideration?
No, ma'am, I don't see carbon sequestration as a calculus in those environmental reviews.
Okay, well, I will follow up on that later. One other quick thing. I'm very familiar with the USDA's regional climate hubs, and I've asked other USDA agencies about their hubs in previous hearings. Based on budget documents that I've received from USDA, I understand the Forest Service spent $3.3 million on the climate hubs in 2016, which I think is great, but the 2019 estimate is $400,000. Given the challenges that we're dealing with, why is this such a big drop, and do you see those as a valuable part of what you're doing?
Yes, our investment and our continued commitment to climate hubs is significant. I don't have the dollar values at hand. I can research that with staff and get back to you or submit it for the record.
Great. Well, I do have great concerns about that number going down, and I appreciate your talking about the value of them, and I am basically out of time. So again, thank you very much for your answer to the questions.
Thank you.
I want to recognize that the chair of the full committee has joined us. Thank you for being here, Chairman Peterson. And I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for being with us today. In your written testimony, you mentioned that perhaps most critically, forest infrastructure provides fire protection for communities, especially by providing access to forest lands and roads for firefighters and emergency responders during rescue operations. Due to the deferred maintenance backlog, how many miles of Forest Service system roads have been decommissioned over the past 10 years?
So I don't have 10-year figures. On an average basis, I think we decommission somewhere between 300 and 400 miles of road a year. It's not strictly related to deferred maintenance. There might be restoration management objectives tied, but in any event, I will get you 10-year figures.
Okay, all right. And during wildfire suppression, what percentage of decommissioned roads from within the fire perimeter are reopened and used for suppression activities? Do you have any idea?
I don't know on a percentage basis.
Okay.
I know we do that. The fire line officer has the call on
right.
that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then to that, can you further elaborate on the potential threat that deferred maintenance poses on being able to respond to wildlife fires and, as a result, additional damage to forest infrastructure?
I can't quantitatively summarize it, but the deferred maintenance accumulates not just on roads, but also our fire guard stations, our air tanker bases, our bunkhouses where our firefighters are housed over the summer. So the accumulated effect of that is our capacity is diminished where it wouldn't otherwise be.
Mm-hmm. And why is your capacity diminished? I mean, why would you do that?
Well, we're not able to house people
Okay.
in bunkhouses because of the deteriorating condition.
I got you. Well, then that gets to my next question. The U.S. Forest Service recently completed its comprehensive capital improvement plan. Can you further detail how you plan to implement this strategy going forward as far as dealing with these issues?
Yes, sir, thank you. So our plan has been released in the last couple of weeks. What it primarily does is identifies criteria for submitting projects for the national prioritization. And those criteria include access to active forest management, access to recreation facilities, access for fire operations, research and development, and revenue-generating destinations. Those criteria are applied to the submitted project. It runs through a model. The model prioritizes projects. And so, we have funding set aside, and you cut off the funding at, the level that...
Right. Outside of that, what's your biggest challenge?
The level of funding.
Level of funding.
Yes, sir.
So you're looking at members of this committee who are members of the United States Congress, and you need more funding.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My district contains all or parts of 6 national forests and the Grand Canyon and 22 other national parks and monuments. And I fully understand the conditions that you are under, because I live in Forest Service country. I also, my house is located, I take Forest Service Road back to the house. So that road hasn't been touched by a blade in about 20 years. And we even offered at one time to pay for part of it, well, half of it, and they still didn't, because they only have one grader for the entire Nicoquinino National Forest. And that grader has to be borrowed by the Kaibab sometimes in order to get some roads done over there. And so this whole concept of, how many personnel has the Forest Service lost, or a percentage, in the last decade because of funding?
So I've heard the figure, a third, 33%, in non-fire professions. I'd have to, double check, is that the last 10 years or some other time period, but that's the figure that I'm familiar with.
And how much more personnel are you going to be able to hire now that you've been able to get the fire funding off your books?
That's a good question. It's not easy to answer. In my own career, we've changed significantly from using Forest Service employees and equipment doing projects, road projects, for example, to funding partners or counties or contract workers. So the increase in funding may not necessarily turn around more, let's say, road crews. What we do need is senior, experienced engineers and specialists who can plan and design the work and then do contract oversight.
Well, let's put it another way. The fire funding's been taken out. How much has been restored to your budget in order to meet your other obligations and
Okay,
needs?
I can do that one. So it goes into effect in 2020. And if we had to request the 10-year average for fire suppression, it would, which we don't because the fire funding fix froze it at 2015 level, we would have to increase the request for fire suppression by $270 million. So what that means is we get to add $270 million back to programs as long as our cap stays the same.
Now, it's also, at least out in the West, I know, and in my district, a lot of the forests were put in place because of watershed protection. What impact has the lack of funding had on the ability of us to protect our watersheds, our wildlife that the hunters love, and our fish and the streams that impact the quality of our tourists and our recreational activities in the forest?
Yes, sir. The two most important things that affect water quality and water coming off national forests is healthy forest condition and maintaining the road system. former longtime member of the House, Norm Dix, used to say, if you don't fix the roads, you're going to drink the roads. So
right.
our inability to maintain the road system contributes to degraded water, overcrowded, overdense forests that stagnate, lead to insect infestation, wildfire. That contributes to poor water quality. We need to take care of those two things.
Well, I want to thank the Forest Service for helping start the Fry project in Arizona. It's been very important. We're on another step now, and hopefully we'll move forward again. But the management process that you just talked about is critical to water protection, watershed protection, and wildlife and the whole ecosystem that there is. And I just look at Arizona as an example. We have millions and millions of acres that are not managed or haven't been able to be managed, I should say, that are just going up in fire all the time, and that's throughout the West. So I'd kind of like to know the plan of attack other than Fry for the other national forests.
Yes, sir. So you might recall we announced an initiative earlier this year that we call shared stewardship. And we are working, we have, I think, 10 states now under an agreement where we're partnering with states to agree on the areas of highest priority treatment, and then we're working on those areas together. And I think that is a commitment that is going to build both support for the work that we need to do and additional capacity for doing it.
Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you. Before moving to recognize members of the full committee, I'm going to recognize for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Iowa who stepped out. Excuse me, I apologize. I will now recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And, you know, I know in your line of work, you get a fair amount of criticism, but I just want to start by saying thank you on a personal basis, ma'am. The Black Hills National Forest is a ways, we've got a very large congressional district. I suppose I'm probably 4 hours from the National Forest, but I can't tell you how many dozens, how many hundreds of memories my family has made in that a great national asset that you, throughout your career and your people, have helped to maintain. And it's wonderful. I mean, some of the most beautiful quiet moments in our lives have been nestled among those Black Hills ponderosa pine. Some of the most active moments of our life have been in that forest. And so thank you for what you're doing. Now, of course, it's not just the Johnson family that enjoys that resource. Every year there are millions of South Dakotans and folks from all over the world who recreate there. I get the sense that our deferred maintenance backlog is perhaps smaller there than in many of the forests we've discussed. And I think perhaps because it is such an actively managed, well-maintained forest. We have some of the highest timber sales of national forests in the country. And so if you're willing to, ma'am, could you elaborate on the connection, if any, that exists between a well-maintained, actively managed forest and the impact that that can have on lower deferred maintenance?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you very much for the compliment. And the Black Hills is a very special place. I agree. All our forests are similar in the way that people love them and rely on them. And that said, they're still unique in their own way. And where a forest is well-maintained, able to reduce deferred maintenance, you know, my guess is that's a forest with a lot of thriving partnerships. We don't have the same ability to partner everywhere. It depends on, you know, opportunity and economic capacity, but it also depends on commitment to partnering. And so I would put my finger on partnerships where the Black Hills are concerned.
Well, I think that is exquisitely well said. I mean, I do think thriving partnerships are a key part of that story. of a lower deferred maintenance backlog and I think higher use of the forest. So thank you for calling out the importance of having a USDA commitment to that, and to the extent that that commitment can even grow in the Black Hills National Forest and elsewhere, I'd certainly love to see more efforts in that regard. I hate to bring up such a terrible subject as the mountain pine beetle, because I know that little fella had done a lot of damage in a lot of places. In the Black Hills, we had less damage from the pine beetle than I think was feared at the onset of this round of the epidemic, and frankly, less damage than many national forests saw. I have attributed that to a more actively managed forest. I want to give you an opportunity to correct my misconception if I have one, and offer any other thoughts you have.
Yes, sir. Definitely, well-maintained forests are in a more vigorous condition, and a more vigorous condition allows forests to repel bark beetle attacks. I mean, it's a native pest. They've been around a long time. What's changed is the vitality of forests and their ability to just naturally withstand them. So I think definitely better maintained forests, active management, such as what we have on the Black Hills, is key to preventing further spread by that insect.
Well, Madam Chair, I would just close by, trying to highlight some of these great phrases this conversation has pulled out, the importance of active management, being well-maintained, and having thriving partnerships. Those are wonderful phrases. Associate Chief, thanks for the work you do, and thanks for your presence here today.
Thank you, sir.
And I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Thompson from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for hosting this, and ranking member for this hearing. Chief, good to see you. Thank you for your service and your record of service to the nation through the Forest Service. Greatly appreciate it. Also, special thanks when you are testifying on the other side of the Capitol in the Senate Agriculture Committee. You used Longhouse Drive in the Allegheny National Forest as an example of the threat of lack of maintenance, that roadways deteriorating. And as you really nicely pointed out in your testimony, the users of that road contribute about $1.5 million a year to the local businesses, the local economy. That just speaks to the importance, the economic importance of this. You've talked a lot about partnership. I want to start out by really, I think one of our best partners, and we have many great partners, obviously, with the Forest Service, but one of the best partners are those from the forest products industry, the timber industry, that bid on contracts, help us to maintain so that we can maintain a healthy forest. We make it so that they're the largest carbon sinks in the world. Also, as my friend across the aisle talked about, making sure that those healthy forests are making sure we have a great filtration system for those watersheds that start in our national forests. And so, I'm concerned right now. So the first thing I have for you is not really looking for a response on, just a request to take back, and I'm going to forward up in writing. But the situation with the tariffs, and specifically the hardwoods industry, we have a lot of folks, good people that have bid and obtained contracts on, and specifically I'm going to speak hardwoods because I've got the Allegheny National Forest. And unfortunately, with the trade wars that are going on, the bottom just completely dropped out of the price. So they bid at a certain price. They're mandated, contracted to pursue that, but they've lost their market for the time being. Now, I will say, talking with them, they're all behind the president and they're supportive, and they want to see, fair and free trade, which is what the president wants. But in the meantime, just two things, if we could look at, that'll be sent along in a written request. Any type of trade relief for our hardwoods, they were not included in that package. And I get it. It's different. Might be because a part of this, it's administered, that part of trade is administered through commerce. I don't know why. Trees are a crop. It's agriculture. But they need, we're hoping actually just to get resolution to trade agreements. But if this goes on for any amount of time, those hardwood folks need this, because if we lose those industries, then we will not have that valuable partner to keep our forests healthy. And in the long run, that would be a deterioration of tremendous proportions of our national forest. The other thing is, the request to take back is we need extension on current contracts. And I would say up to a period of 2 years at this point, because they're just, there's not a business plan given what the contracts are at and where the pricing has fallen. And so that may be a little more difficult, I understand, but those are just, don't really looking for a response on that. If you could take that back, and I'll be following back up with certainly the Secretary and the President on those. Yeah, the most pressing maintenance issue that we currently have in Allegheny National Forest is the Mayberg Bridge located in Forest County. You know, there are 128 permanent and seasonal dwellings in Mayberg and the bridge, which is owned by the Forest Service, and it's the only really practical year-round route in and out of that village. Thankfully, we don't have any kids right now living in that area, so there's no school buses, because that bridge would not handle a school bus, and I would be concerned if there's a fire, because an emergency vehicle is not going to be handled as well. Unfortunately, the bridge has fallen into disrepair and in need of critical repairs. Now, the Forest Service, excuse me, has indicated that the funding will be coming for the bridge, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about the future. Now, clearly, maintenance for infrastructure like this must be a priority, yet it's not being completed. So, simple question, how is the Forest Service prioritizing this kind of maintenance, especially when it comes down to access for local residents and public safety?
Excuse me. Thank you, Congressman. I thought we had got the funding for that bridge and completed the environmental analysis, and I thought it was moving forward. I will double check on that. Funding for maintenance is part of regional allocations, and the priorities for maintenance is decided at the local level. When it exceeds routine maintenance and becomes a capital investment, then it's going to be subject to that capital investment strategy and those criteria for prioritization that I mentioned.
I also appreciate your engagement with the community, because it was apparent in the beginning. I'm not sure the Forest Service, whoever was involved, even locally, recognized that there was a permanent village, basically. People lived there year-round, and quite frankly, it was the only way in and out. So, but because of how you all did conduct yourselves, engaging the community, that all came to light, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the support with the Mayberg Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ms. Lago, thank you for coming today and joining us. It's great to have a witness with experience in Washington forests, and I would love to host you back at home, along with the Forest Service chief in the district, which, by the way, includes Mount Rainier, the Snoqualmie Mount Baker National Forest, Mountains to Sound Greenway.
Beautiful area.
Chelan, Stehekin, everything, to raise some of these very issues on deferred maintenance. And in addition to the deferred maintenance projects, the Forest Service Legacy Roads and Trails Remediation Program is a critical program that leverages dollars outside of the Forest Service to address water quality issues. And I have a appropriations letter for the record that I'd like to submit outlining the importance of that program and the need for it to have a dedicated line item.
So noted.
The program was created in 2008 because the general Forest Service road maintenance budget was unable to address the sheer volume of blocked culverts, landslides, and washouts, which were impacting water quality and access for threatened and endangered species. And in Washington State and other parts of the country, the program is critical to address water quality issues and habitat, particularly for Chinook salmon, bull trout, and steelhead. These fish are an important part of the Northwest culture, heritage, ecosystem, and they have suffered heavily, as you know. A recent New York Times report stated that the Chinook salmon may be extinct in 20 years. I'll also add that Chinook salmon are the key food source for the endangered southern resident orcas. And old weather-damaged roads and broken culverts are key culprits in this demise. And Washington State has invested millions, multiple millions of dollars to address downstream barriers and culverts, including dams and whatnot. while the Chinook salmon spawning grounds are located upstream in the National Forest headwaters. And on page 4 of your testimony, you outline the criteria for road projects listing priorities. And unfortunately, the projects that improve wildlife and aquatic passage are last. And so I was just wondering if you could expand on this and help me understand how projects affecting water quality can be addressed in a timely manner when the Forest Service is facing a $5 billion plus backlog.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. And when I was still in the Pacific Northwest, we hosted a chief's review, and the theme of the entire review was Save Our Salmon, and really understand the integral role of salmon in the economy and lifestyle and that ecosystem. So in addition to the criteria, which includes benefits, the ability to be an economic driver and water and recreation, there is an intangible benefit criteria. Salmon is a lot more, and water quality is a lot more than an intangible benefit, certainly. And local managers also, there is a layer where they put a personal priority on their projects based on their knowledge of local issues and what's important to the local economy, people, community. So there is more than just the criteria that I named in my testimony. I think it's fair to really think about how we're valuing water, the economic value of water, as well as the fact that we all rely on it. So I'll go back and discuss that.
Thank you. And the way I interpreted economic was really related to timber, but if you think about the recreational economy and salmon and habitat and our tribes, that those do weave in economics. And then I appreciate your going back. I think that is it. I would just like to reiterate my invitation and thank you for paying attention to this issue. And I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes, Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you allowing me to sit in on this very important hearing, especially when it comes to my district on the Central Coast. Ranking Member LaMalfa, good morning, and good morning, Chief. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your testimony and appreciate your service. I represent the Central Coast of California, Big Sur, Los Padres National Forest. And in 2016, I'm sure you know well, we had a pretty extensive fire there called the Soberanes fire, which encompassed about 206 square miles being burned at a cost at the time was the most expensive in our nation's history at the time, until recently, a cost of about $260 million. The reason that fire started was because of an illegal campfire, unfortunately. And we're seeing a lot of that, especially in Los Padres Forest, in the sense that you have a number of people out there, despite the numerous signs everywhere saying, don't do something as stupid as that. But people, continue to conduct themselves in that manner, unfortunately. Obviously, it would be nice to have staff there, Forest Service officers there, who actually are on the grounds and enforcing those types of laws. But unfortunately, we've had to resort to certain volunteers who go there. I say unfortunately because that shouldn't be their job. And they're not armed, they don't have the right law and the legal background to enforce those types of laws. But that's what we've have had to resort to in order to ensure that people are out there making sure that people don't do these acts that could threaten the forest, could threaten people. Obviously, staffing is a big issue, and you know that. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on any sort of plans that you have to address the chronic staffing issues, obviously not just in Los Padres National Forest, but in other national forests across our country.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So as I mentioned, and I'm not sure if you were in the room at the time.
And I apologize if I'm not, I just came in late. Thank you.
No problem. The result of the fire funding fix is we have room, if our cap stays the same, to request funding for other programs that would have had to go to the 10-year average for fire suppression. And so we're deeply aware of the shortages in many programs. Law enforcement and fire prevention are two of the areas. Forest protection officers, which is a designation for people in all kinds of resources, but in addition to their resource job, they patrol. So having more people on the ground is something that we're acutely aware of. We did get direct hire authority recently for firefighting jobs, which allows us to more efficiently hire people to be on the ground. It will last for 1 year while OPM sees how we use it. So being more, there's not unlimited money, we all know that. So being more efficient with the money that we have and prioritizing these on-the-ground activities is how we can address those issues.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, obviously, and I know you've talked about deferred maintenance, and in Los Padres, I think our deferred maintenance exceeds about $24 million. And first of all, my question is, where does that lie relative to other national forests and deferred maintenance?
You know, I believe I submitted for the record a deferred maintenance breakdown by state.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have one by forest, but I'm sure it exists, and I'd be happy to supply it.
Understood, understood. Obviously, as we approach the start of the new fiscal year, and with the wildfire, and as the wildfire fix funding becomes available, can you give me a little bit of light on the priorities, a little bit of light on your priorities, specifically whether you'll be prioritizing deferred maintenance backlog? I'd like to hear about Los Padres, but I'd be more than willing to hear about California.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of people will eventually weigh in on what the priorities are.
Sure.
We've had a continuing emphasis on active management and reducing fuels. I don't see that changing. This hearing helps us highlight the issue of maintenance and deferred maintenance for our facilities. It's felt throughout the Forest Service and throughout the communities that we serve. So I'm happy to work with you and your staff and this committee staff on how to prioritize going forward.
Outstanding. I look forward to that. I'll yield back my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With the first round of questions completed and without objection, we will begin a second round of questions. Members will be recognized for 3 minutes in order of seniority. All right, I will begin by recognizing myself for 3 minutes. Associate Chief Lago, thank you for all of your answers today. And I would also offer for the hearing record a copy of the Department of Commerce's report on outdoor recreation economy. The report released just last week shows that the outdoor recreation economy accounted for 2.2% of GDP and supported 5.2 million jobs in 2017. This not only includes conventional activities like camping, hiking, boating, but also value-added activities such as construction and travel. For the first time, the report included information on the recreations industry's contributions by state. Is data from reports like this considered as the Forest Service prioritizes maintenance? And does the Forest Service use data like this to leverage assistance from states and other partners?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, with regard to that report, it's interesting that the statistic of 2.2% might sound small, but it is interesting to note that it is growing almost 50% faster than general GDP. And I can tell you from the communities that I've lived in, the ones that I hear from that depend on a recreation economy, it is far more impactful to their economies than 2.2%. We recognize that I think 15 states across the country now have recreation officers, so showing that states recognize the importance of this recreation economy. It's not right for every state, but definitely the recognition of the Commerce Department, our own within USDA, not just our agency, but rural development, has a expanding recreation economy interest. So it helps us bring partners to the table. It helps us bring investors to the table. So to answer your question in a word, yes.
Thank you so much. And coming from the Commonwealth of Virginia, where we have seen recreation continue to be a strong use of our natural resources and a major economic driver here, I thank you for your comments. I now recognize Mr. LaMalfa for 3 minutes.
Thank you again. I appreciate again Assistant Chief Lago for your being here. I wanted to delve a little more into with the road maintenance and the issues there where access has been more difficult over the years. So we've wrestled in Northern California with what's being put on travel management plans, and it seems like it just means less and less access. We're finding more and more closed gates and less ability for people during the snow season for snowmobiling or for off-road activity, hunting, anybody able to take vehicles in, or even without vehicles, that we're finding more and more closed gates. And so does this tie in partly towards a changing view of the multi-purpose, multi-use forest policy, or is it more about the backlog we have of maintenance? You talk about bridges being removed and no longer counting them as an asset, but they're a great amount of frustration by my constituents, and I think neighboring districts as well, is that whether you call it the travel management plan or the maintenance backlog, it's just meaning less access. So does travel management plan efforts, are they moving in that direction because of the lack of maintenance, or is it some other philosophical shift?
Thank you, Ranking Member. So it is not we're not walking away from the multiple use sustained yield mandate from Congress. It is more the observation that when we want people to have access to their public lands, they don't need public lands if they don't have access to them. But we need to maintain the resource in a healthy condition, but we also need to maintain those roads in a safe condition for people to use them, roads and trails. So our effort at travel management is aimed at looking at the resource from the standpoint of what can we safely provide.
Okay. Well, even as Mr. Panetta mentioned there, he had a 6-digit fire in number of acres in his district. We have multiple 6-digit fires in the more northern part and other western states. And an important component of being able to do the pre-fire work is this access, and as well as when it does come to fire suppression time, having these roads available and intact bridges and all that, and not closed gates and all that. So can you please comment on the fire aspect of that and how important it is we step back up on this?
Well, yes, sir. Roads are an essential way that we stop fires before they get large, get people out of harm's way when there are fires, and we absolutely need a safe, accessible road system to be able to fulfill that part of our mission.
The multi-use. Okay, thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Thompson for 3 minutes.
Chairwoman, thank you. Chief, I just want to check in. I know in the Forest Service we use a concessionaire style approach, and concessionaires play a very important role. Obviously, they help us where we, it helps supplement the staffing and keeping areas open and access. The system is, my understanding, it's the Granger-Thai Act, which basically defines a landlord-tenant relationship where the Forest Service is a landlord responsible for all the behind-the-wall fixes, including the maintenance, capital improvements, and the tenant, the concessionaire, basically just keeps everything clean and operating. My question for you is, would you like to have the authority actually that has been granted to the Department of Defense and to the Army Corps of Engineers, which allows basically where 30-year leases are an option, not mandated, but an option, and in that 30 years, that longevity, what would be the concessionaires have, are able to take on the responsibility for some of the capital improvements. Today, that doesn't occur in the Forest Service with the concessionaire system. I don't know the timeline on when the Department of Defense and the Army Corps made that transition. It's just a simple question. Is that something the Forest Service would want to consider getting the authority to do? Obviously, we would have to provide that through the Farm Bill or whatever.
Yes, sir. I'm not sure what the Army Corps of Engineers authority is, but in fact, the Forest Service did get leasing authority in the 2018 Farm Bill. We're developing rules and directives, but it would enable us to do those kind of long-term leases. I'm not sure the time period, but also to enable the leaseholder to do improvements. I think the Park Service has some kind of authority like that, too. I can check on that and get back to you.
Sounds good. I appreciate that. It just seems like it's working well with the Army Corps. I've seen some of the projects, obviously, in my congressional district from time to time with that these folks do, and so it'd be great to be able. I'm glad to hear that we provide at least part of that authority. And
yes, sir.
If we haven't done enough, please let us know. We want you to have the authority to be successful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
And I now recognize Ranking Member LaMalfa for one more 3-minute question.
Just one more. Thank you so much. Again, when we're talking about the backlog, when we're seeing the Forest Service absorbing more land through donations from maybe NGOs or other instances, or the LWCF has also introduced more land back into Forest Service control. How is that contributing to the backlog and your ability to keep up, and as well as updating this $5.2 billion backlog figure?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm not sure what the value or the assets that a lot of the lands that we acquire through Land and Water Conservation Fund. I am familiar with areas that we prioritize because they have important wildlife habitat value, water quality value, that kind of thing, which leads me to think they don't have a lot of infrastructure on them. But I don't know that conclusively, and I would have to do some checking.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in that, of how much that's adding to the burden of an already difficult situation. So with that, I appreciate it, Madam Chairman, and for your appearance today, Ms. Lago, and I will yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Associate Chief Lago for her comments and for her time here today. What we've heard today underscores the importance of the Forest Service's work and the challenges it faces. I hope we all leave here with an appreciation for the role that well-maintained forest infrastructure can have significant impacts on people's lives, their work, and their play in and around national forests, as well as the communities and economies surrounding our national forests. We've also heard loud and clear that dozens of infrastructure projects are ready for implementation, but require the necessary funding. And carrying out these much-needed maintenance projects will support jobs in rural communities as soon as the Forest Service receives the funding to complete them. I hope that we all leave here with a better sense of what we can do in this subcommittee to help the Forest Service carry out its mission. And again, I thank you, Ms. Lago, for your time today. Before we adjourn, I invite the ranking member to make any closing remarks that he may have. Without any, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplemental written responses from the witness to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry is adjourned.